When does a work trial not make sense? If the plan is like you understand you're going to be training this person, you're going to be ramping them up, you intend to have that period where it's like, that it's going to take 3, 6, 12 months for them to fully hit the ground running and you want to invest that time. When does a work trial make sense? When you need this person to hit the ground running on day 1 or day 30 and be carrying a bag, be making strategic impact already.
Initiating becoming a hiring machine sequence in 3, 2, 1.
Hey everyone, it's Sam Keenley, and welcome back to Becoming a Hiring Machine. This is the show dedicated to fixing recruitment by going beyond saying what needs to change and instead teaches you how to make that change. Today, we've got a great trending topics episode ahead of us, but before we get into that, just want to tell you a little bit about the show. Essentially, we've got shows within the show here. Some days we have interviews with industry thought leaders and others who are shaking up the space. Other days, like today, we cover trending topics, items that recruiters are talking about or will be very soon, and what those mean for them. Stop by every Tuesday for a Tactical Tuesday where we go deep on how to do something that's going to help you drive better results in your day-to-day. Every once in a while, we open it up for Q&A. Listeners can drop in questions for us, so send those to us at podcast@loxo.co. And occasionally hear a mic drop episode from Matt where he shares something that he's been thinking about within the recruitment space and wants you to know. All right, today's trending topic. Got interview projects, take-home assignments, work trials, call them what you want, but these are coming up more and more as part of the hiring process, and it's causing quite the discussion among recruiters, candidates, hiring managers, and more. So for today, Lex is joining us to unpack this trending topic, the pros, the cons, the future of it, and everything else that you need to know next time this conversation comes up around your water cooler. So with that, let's jump in. Lex, welcome back.
Thanks. Good to be here and excited to talk about work trials. I find it to be a very interesting topic of discussion. Having done several work trials myself, I feel like I have some thoughts on the matter. But I feel like we should start at ground level. Just what is a work trial? Just in case you haven't experienced one of these before as a recruiter or even as a candidate. A work trial is basically during the interview process, an assignment that is representative of the future role in some sense. A work trial can be paid or unpaid. We'll get into that a little bit in our discussion, the pros and cons of each of those. But the idea is to create a sense of realism during the interview process that allows you to gauge culture fit as well as skills fit in a way that you don't really get from just a Q&A style interview. So there are obvious reasons why work trials are very popular and are something that, especially as we're getting more critical over culture fits and over just like really making sure a candidate has the skills that they say they have, bringing them into the mix. There's a famous or infamous, I guess, horror story on Reddit of a candidate who was applying for a job in a newsroom and said that they had a certain level of video editing skills, that they were like, I have all the other skills. If I can just kind of schmooze my way through the process, I'll learn this and be good to go. But there was a work trial in the interview. They brought the girl in to the editing room right then and there and said, hey, can you like piece this together for us? And she was totally clueless. And so that's a perfect example of why it's always good to be prepared, but also some of the more tangible benefits of a work trial where you get to see that stuff in real time. So with that being said, I'll dive into some of the high-level pros for a work trial, and then we can get into some of the like flip side of things where it might get a little bit dicey. Number one, which I already kind of touched on, is just the fact that you do get valuable insights into the candidate's skills and performance. It's something that you're able to gauge in real time in a way that you just simply can't get from a conversation, which I think is extremely valuable, especially for skills-based roles, technical roles, anything that involves like some very niche skill set. You want to make sure that even just beyond having a conversation about it, this candidate can actually do what they claim. It also is a good way to assess culture fit. A lot of work trials will involve other team members. It'll be something that's very collaborative, and it might be a way for other team members to even kind of come in and assess the work that the candidate has submitted during the work trial, which I find really interesting because you're already building some sense of internal rapport through the interview process itself and through that work trial, seeing if these people work well together, seeing how they collaborate, how they receive feedback in real time, all of that becomes really important for creative roles. It becomes really important for, even some technical roles, and especially roles that are going to be very cross-functional and working with a lot of different team members. We've talked a lot about Posthog, their marketing. They have a fantastic website. If you've not seen it, it's definitely worth checking out. They've got a ton of like little cute animated hedgehogs throughout their site, and I just love them. But the CEO and co-founder of Postdog, James Hawkins, he said, a work trial makes it obvious who to hire. It's frequently surprising how someone performs relative to what we thought they would in their interview about their skills. So it can be a very enlightening process. And I think a lot of hiring managers specifically really like the fact that it really brings some of that stuff to the surface. So that's a really big part of the process in terms of like the pros of it. Do you want to add anything to that side of things before I shift into the cons?
Yeah, well, let's talk about the good stuff before we get into the
Yeah.
other side of it. So, yeah, I mean, having like you, we've gone through it from the candidate side, gone through it from the hiring side as well. And so, where I see so much value in is what you're talking about, like when you have niche skills or anything else like that. So, I know I was hiring for a very specific type of marketer before, demand marketers, digital marketers. And it's very, very easy to say, oh, I'm a Google Ads expert. I'm a display marketing expert. I've got the certification. You can go take the YouTube course or whatever it is. And if you just rank or like think of candidates based at that level, it's like, okay, yeah, they are. But what we would do is we would put them through an exercise. It's nothing crazy, but it's like that video editing story where you put them just like, hey, hop on this platform, just like build a quick campaign for me. Show me where you would do this. You're not trying to pull a fast one on them. You're asking them a basic question. If you truly do have the skills within that platform, that niche, whatever it is, like it would be easy for you to do. But I don't know. Unfortunately, in today's day and age, people don't always have it, or they over emphasize the skills that they may or may not have. So I'm a big fan of that. Again, not as a gotcha, but just to confirm, do they have the skills that they need? Or maybe they had the expertise skills 5, 10, 20 years ago, which they haven't kept up with it. There's a reason you have to do continued education credits when you're in the medical field. Same kind of thing when you're in a specific skill set. So that's one thing that I want to get to. And then the other is you were talking about the cultural fit. That one's, I really
Mm.
like that because I think people don't always think about this, especially when you start to loop in other members from different departments or other people who are involved in the process. Because I'm sure we can all think back to the time that we went through an interview loop with a company where we met with 3 to 5 different people. And you could have sworn that 80% of the questions were the exact same for every person. Tell me about your strengths. Tell me about your weaknesses. If you were trapped in a room with 100 marbles, what would you do with them to get out? Like, just the crazy things
I've
that
never
no
heard
one
that
cares
one.
about. It's not marbles. How many marbles could he fit in a room that's like 10 by 10 or something? Just like things that's like, I don't know. I was here to talk about marketing, not marbles. But you get those same questions over and over. So what I do like about this is, one, from a candidate experience, it's also a little bit better where at least it keeps you from having to go through that. It's almost like a gauntlet of the same boring questions over and over, and gives you a chance to shine. And also for a lot of people, their strength is their ability to collaborate. And you and I both know if you put like team player on a resume, people are like, yeah, I'd hope so. But this really shines a light on like, are you a team player? Do you know how to collaborate and communicate well with others who are in different departments and be able to speak their language, understand it, take that feedback? So I think those are two big pros that, again, it's like it's hard to see on paper, but that's what comes out when you do go through these types of trials or activities.
Totally. I think it is one of those things that just makes everything that you could put on a resume or everything that you could claim in an interview, it makes it super tangible and makes it
Mm-hmm.
very actionable in a way where it's like, okay, I can see that this person can do what they say that they can. And I can also see like we have a good vibe. I like working with this person. My team likes this person. Well, let's bring them on board. It's a no-brainer. I think the interesting thing is I have in multiple cases been hiring for freelance content writers or in-house content writers. There's obviously that's a role that naturally lends itself to having some element of an assignment pre second interview. You might do kind of an intro call with this person, see if they're a good, just vibe check type
Mm-hmm.
situation, and then have them do an assignment. And it is, I mean, I totally agree with the CEO of Postdoc. It is so wild the things that come back because there's such a range, even
Mm-hmm.
within conversations like intro calls that you would have put all at the same level of promise. The results that you get from a work study like that are just insane in terms of how much of a variation there is and how bad some of the work can be, and then how surprisingly good some of the work can be. So, in roles like that, it just is one of those things where you don't really want to feel duped when you bring someone on board and realize, okay, they can't actually do what I thought they could. If
Mm-hmm.
they're a great culture fit, and maybe there's a little bit of a skills gap that you're willing to train them up on, that's another story. But you want to be aware of that before you bring them in house.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. No, I couldn't agree more. So
All
those are
right. Should we
all
get to
the
the
good things.
yeah
Yeah.
the flip side of the coin now? We have to go there. So I think the biggest, like most obvious one is this is a very time consuming process for the candidate and then also for the team. This requires a lot of different people involved much of the time, or it requires a lot of one person's time. There were multiple times where my entire job was just scanning through these content, assignments, grading them essentially, and not really having much time or much mental ability to focus on actual job priorities. And so it's a very real struggle that, yes, something like this can turn up incredible results and can surface some things that you wouldn't have found otherwise. But it is a very time consuming process for recruiters, for hiring managers, for the entire team in many cases, depending on how involved this work trial is. So I think that that's something to just be really aware of from an internal resources standpoint, and then also just out of consideration for the candidate themselves, especially in competitive hiring markets. Some candidates will see that there's a work trial or an assignment involved, and they'll just turn the other way because they have no assurance that this is going to pan out. They don't know for sure if this is a worthy investment of their time because they've been burned before. There's probably been so many candidates who have done an assignment and then have had it just kind of go nowhere. So I think that that's just something to be aware of and to be considerate of in this process. I think that an easy workaround there is the time in the interview process that you bring a work trial into the mix. Like, this is not something that should be right off the bat, but maybe rather, okay, we've narrowed it down to 2 to 3 candidates. Which of these candidates is the best fit based off of the results of this work trial? There are definitely ways to make this feel a little bit more reasonable, but you see things on LinkedIn all the time, post job descriptions that include, hey, if you want to be eligible to even apply to this job, send us X, Y, and Z, an assignment. And it's just like, there's so much out there that if you want to be competitive, that's a really tough place to start from.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that timing element is so critical, both from the time invested that you do it and also the timing of when you introduce this assignment as part of the hiring process. So when you do it within the process, I definitely don't, this shouldn't be an early screening type thing. This should be later on once you've whittled down. Because again, your time as a hiring manager, your time as a recruiter, the individuals that are part of the interview process, like, you shouldn't be doing this for tens, hundreds of candidates. You should be doing this to kind of separate the last like 3 to 5 great candidates that you might have. Because again, that's going to be 3 to 5 hours on your part sitting in meetings, and that's going to be however long it takes them to prepare for that separately. So that's definitely something you want to think about. But in terms of, well, I don't have 5 hours to interview people. Do you have the time to afford to make a bad hire? Because I mean, that's what this is really going after, is like, well, yeah, you can let people in the door left and right. They're like, okay, but if you're going to be picking up their slack, if they're not going to be doing the job that you want, if they're not going to be as great as they could be, like, I would almost say this is the front end investment in order to truly ensure that you're making, instead of, picking from a pool that's got some A players, some B players, some C players, and some people have different skills. Some people can talk the talk a little bit better than others. This ensures that you're getting that A player that you really want for your organization. So I think that's one thing that I always keep in the back of my mind is coming back to saying, like, it's worth it as a hiring manager, as a recruiter, to spend that time. But again, at the appropriate time within the hiring process.
Yeah, that's a great point.
I like that point you brought up. It turns away some potential candidates, especially good ones. So that's one that I'd say, like, let's think about that one a little bit. One, you have people, if you say it early on, and if you're going to introduce that early on, it's like, yeah, they probably been burned. I wouldn't want to do that if that's like, the gate to entry is so high that you have to do that just to jump through those hoops early. But again, if you're only posting and praying and putting this up on Indeed, maybe this is doing you a favor by screening out a lot of the candidates that you would have DQ'd later on. Like, you're getting people that truly are invested. So again, I'm not recommending that you do the project early on, but that's one pro that you could pull out of it in that sense. But the other side is, if you're truly going outbound, you're a recruiter, you're tasked with finding these people, you come across phenomenal candidates, you say, hey, there's going to be a project later on. They're like, I don't know, that's not for me. I would also say, as a recruiter, that's part of your job, to convince people to say, like, I promise it'll be worth it. Like, you're a perfect fit. I really think this is going to be good. Explain what the project is. Show them, like, it's not scary. Hear them out. Like, I've had a bad experience before. Well, what went on? Like, give them some assurances that, it's not like that. I can promise you can start to get in some questions. I know you've got some different discussion points that we'll get into around, like, what candidates might be asking. But that's where I say, like, it might scare them off. But again, if you're truly like a headhunter or a recruiter that's going after these people, that's part of why you're probably being brought on by this hiring company to bring these people in.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I think ultimately too, the reason that people have a very negative association with work trials is often because they're not used very effectively. And I think that
Hmm.
that's a good opportunity too for a recruiter to one kind of coach the hiring team into what is an effective work trial, what does that look like, and then be able to advocate for that process to the candidate and say, "Hey, listen, I know you've probably done stuff like this before and it was just kind of you did it because you had to. It didn't really tie back to anything. It didn't really feel worth your time. And then maybe you never even heard anything back after. Like that's super disappointing. But I can promise you that this will be different. And being able to have that assurance that that's true and that you can stand on that, I think makes such a huge difference for this job and then for any other, just building that relational rapport with a candidate and being able to say like I'm someone you can trust my
Hmm.
opinion here, like I'm not going to ask you to do something that's going to waste your time. So I think that that's like a really key piece of it is like if you're really building a relationship, this is an opportunity to do that, to have honest discourse around this and to get like to gather really interesting data and insights around okay, what experiences have candidates had that they didn't like when it comes to work trials and what are some experiences that they've had that really gave them an interesting understanding of what they'd be getting themselves into. One thing
Hmm.
that I think is cool about a work trial is from the candidate's perspective too, through that process, they might realize, this isn't really a good fit for me. I didn't really like, the way that we talked about my work. I didn't like the way that it was received. I didn't like the assignment itself. There's a lot of different things that can come out through that process on both sides. And I think that often it's seen as like this revealing process for the hiring team. But I think that candidates should look at it as one for them as well, where it's like, okay, I'm gauging whether or not this place is a good fit for me, if my skills are valued here, if I feel equipped to do this job. Was this difficult? Was this stressful for me? Or was it a breeze? Like, did I love doing this assignment? And I think that
Hmm.
that is, we're talking about cons, but that's actually a pro.
Yeah.
That's
No, I
actually a
mean,
pro for it. Yeah.
I like the discussion that you're bringing about with this because, yeah, there's so many different things. I'm going to jump on that one about the candidates. Like, we used to ask this question to people was they'd go through the process, they'd do the assignment, they'd present it to us, and then the first thing I'd say is like, what do you think of that? That's a glimpse of the day in the life of this role. Did you enjoy it? Did you find it interesting, invigorating, anything else? And that's going to quickly tell you too, because like from their side, if they're like, I don't know, like that's where you can just be a good person. Say, well, it might not be the best fit for you. Like we really love you as a person, but if you don't love this, you're not going to be happy here. So you can have it from that side. Um, but yeah, on the recruiter side, one thing I you said that I actually really like, we're always talking about how can recruiters be better partners to hiring organizations, like true advisors and everything else. The more of these that you do or have done, you can then take that to the hiring organization and be like, this is what you should be thinking about as part of work trial. This is what you should avoid as it. And you can help them structure what is the assignment? How do you want to go about it? What are the criteria, the guidelines, the frameworks that we need to be putting together for it? Because not all companies are good at pulling these together, or sometimes they think they are, but they actually aren't. Sometimes they have phenomenal ones that you're just like, I kind of want to copy that and take it over to the other clients that I'm working with. So there's so many things that you as a recruiter can pull out of this as well that can help you with future biz dev, client work, anything else.
And I feel like, the important element here, as is the case with so many elements of recruitment in general, is this is a very nuanced thing. Work trials should look different depending on the role, depending on the company, depending on the company's size. And so I think that this is an opportunity for recruiters who really know their niche to kind of step in that advisor role and say, listen, with roles like this, these are the types of work trials, sorry, that I have seen be the most effective. There are a couple of things that I want to kind of discuss. We've gotten into some of these things already throughout the process, but some things I want to circle back to, and then a couple of new data points I kind of want to dig into a little bit. The first thing, and I think we've kind of touched on this a little bit, but I think it's good to help really firm this up, is just what is a fair and reasonable ask of a candidate? Knowing what they're up against from the standpoint of, many of these candidates might have other opportunities circling around. They might have other recruiters reaching out to them. They might be applying to other jobs actively. Their time is a valuable resource. So, how do you make sure that your work trial is something reasonable to expect of a candidate? I think that that's like an interesting thing to discover. And I don't have like a good gut feeling on that. I think for me, I lean more towards the stage in the process and being transparent about the fact that there will be a work trial and what it will look like is important. But from the actual time commitment, I'm curious to hear what you think is reasonable.
Hmm. Yeah, that's always a hard one. So we used to do this in a former job as I was a director level role, a lot of strategy, not so much the execution side of it, but The project itself, we would be very explicit. We would basically give them a brief, say, pull together your thoughts, come up with a strategy, how you would achieve this goal. We're going to role play, pretend that you're presenting this to the C-suite and be able to communicate that effectively. We would give them data points, metrics, everything that they need. Like, they don't have to go and do research. They should take the knowledge that we assume they have based on the skill set that they have, the experience that they have, to pull this together. And we would say this exercise shouldn't take you more than 3 hours to prepare. If you're spending more than that, you're probably overthinking it, overdoing it. But that's where it's like, well, some people are like, I want to go above and beyond to show it. But we're trying to set expectations saying, like, we don't expect you to put 10, 20, 30 hours into this. Like, this really should be a few hours, give or take. And if you have questions, we let's say, like, send us an email, reach out to us as soon as you have a question about it. Like, if you get caught up on something, ask. We're here to help. We want you to be successful as part of it. So in terms of like what's a fair ask, I'd say, like, set them up for success, where give them everything. Like, if you're looking for certain answers, if you're looking for certain outcomes, give them everything that they would need to do that. Like, there shouldn't be any hoops that they have to jump through, or crazy software things that they would need to buy in order to solve for it. Give them what they need to be successful. Give them a sense of the time commitment that they should be able to do it in, and then give them that hand holding option. Reach out to me, reach out to your recruiter, whoever that is. Like, we're here to help. That's what we want to do.
Yeah, it's interesting that you say that because in Lenny's podcast, like the newsletter that came out, I forget which company this was, who he was interviewing, but one of the CEOs was basically saying that the work trial that they offer is one that can't be completed in a day, but they say you have a day to do this. And the way that they approach it is they say you're not going to be able to get to everything, but they kind of evaluate the candidates off of what they prioritize, what they get into, what they finish, and it reveals a lot too. To me, that makes me so anxious to think about. Like, I would probably stay up 24 hours and try to find a way to get it done. But it's really interesting to think about. You're kind of evaluating the strategic side of the candidate as well, of like, okay, how are they approaching this? Where are they kind of deciding what priorities to focus in on first? And so I found that interesting. It does feel like a little bit of a bait and switch, but they're upfront from the jump about the fact that there's too much work and it won't be completed. But I don't know. I found that interesting. My gut tells me, like, I don't really love that approach, but it works for them. So again, this is where the nuance comes into the mix of, for certain jobs, for certain companies, certain things might make sense that just don't in other roles. So that's an important thing to kind of remember and lean into, is like, every niche is going to have its own kind of like quirks, and you've got to be aware of that and kind of use that to your advantage in these conversations and in, building out the interview structure and the process. So the next question is basically, when does a work trial definitely not make sense in your opinion?
I think it's almost the inverse of what we were talking about earlier. This is really good for fleshing out specific skills, very specific expertise items. When does it not make sense? Entry-level positions, very high rep positions in terms of, like, think of if you're a business development representative, like, hey, for the interview, you're going to jump on calls for an hour and see how many connects you can get with people. Like, I'm not going to go and put them through it. Granted, there are different things that you could ask them if you wanted to do something like that. Like, how would you go and prioritize, you have 100 accounts, how would you get in front of them? Something like that. But I think that this is more, to me, when you need to hire the exact perfect person for the role, for the skill set, for the company that you're at, and everything else, to really guarantee, if it's a position that, turns over every 12 months, if it's something that's a little bit lower risk, it might not be worth the time investment for the team to go through all that, in the current or the standard hiring process might make sense. So I don't know. That's a tough one. It's one of those where I'm sure that we'll come back in a week and think like, oh, that scenario would have been good. That scenario would have been good. And we'll almost want to have a part two, but that's my first take at it. What about you?
We can add it to the show notes if we think of anything crazy. I agree with you. I think that there is, with entry-level roles specifically, roles where the expectation is that you'd almost be kind of training this person up a little bit. I think, it's not that it's unreasonable to expect, but I think it is one of those things where you're going in with lower expectations in the beginning. I think that for roles that culture fit matters super, super high and skills fit matters super, super high, you really want to make sure that you're finding the exact right person, just like you said. I think that for the most part, some element of a work trial, even if it's just, this is not a work trial, but having more of a social interview with the entire team that they'll be working with. I feel like that's a missed piece of the puzzle a lot of the time when it comes to interviewing. When you get to those final stages, it seems like just another hoop to jump through or just another interview to add to the list. But I think it really helps both parties evaluate, okay, is this a good fit from just a vibes perspective? Do I like these people? Do I want to work with them? Do I think we'd collaborate well? So I think like I would even bucket that in the same mentality of like a work trial, in the sense of you're getting a really good feel in a way that you can't through a traditional interview of whether or not this person is the right fit. So I think, yeah, there are ways, creative ways to gather this information outside of just assigning a candidate something. And that's the challenge that I would offer to hiring teams, recruiters. Like, how can I get this data and this information, even if a work trial might not make sense?
Mm-hmm. You said something in there that I think simplified it in my mind as we go through it. And this is why I love these conversations with you. All right. When does a work trial not make sense? If the plan is like, you understand you're going to be training this person, you're going to be ramping them up, you intend to have that period where it's like, that it's going to take 3, 6, 12 months for them to fully hit the ground running and you want to invest that time. When does a work trial make sense? When you need this person to hit the ground running on day 1 or day 30 and be carrying a bag, be making strategic impact already. That's where it's like, I need to make sure that they've got this stuff done under their belt so they can do it. So that's how I might think about it in oversimplified purpose.
Yeah, no, that's a good way of thinking about it. Like, what is the ramp time on this role? What is the possible ramp time? If it's a little bit longer, there's more runway, then okay, maybe we don't have to do this. But if I need this person hitting the ground running, you want to make sure that they're able to, and that, yeah, they have. I think the other thing that a work trial can reveal is whether or not someone is willing to go the extra mile, even for just like an assignment that in the grand scheme of things isn't really actual work. Are they willing to like kind of show you the way that they've approached this with strategy, with that like leadership mentality? And I think that, yeah, again, that's one of those qualitative insights that comes out of that process and kind of gives you the confidence to say, all right, I'm going to hire this person and they're going to add value instantly.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so the next really juicy piece of this, and this is where I find the most interesting conversation around work trials, is paid or unpaid. There are a lot of really, really strong opinions about this matter, about whether or not a work trial, 1, should be expected, and 2, whether or not it should be paid. I see posts on my LinkedIn feed daily about this topic, about just, interview process hoops in general, and then specifically around work trials, and a lot of really interesting conversation and discourse around the payment element of things. Do you have any strong gut feelings before I get into some takes that I've seen floating around?
I do, but I want you to read these first.
Okay. All right. I'll let these LinkedIn commenters be the scapegoat at first, and then we can give our opinions after. I'll anonymize them though. But I saw this interesting post from the founder of a recruitment firm. She basically said, if you ask candidates to do a project as part of their interview, pay them for it. Their time is valuable, and if they're the right fit, they'll end up making your company a lot more money than what you paid them to do the work. 100% worth the investment, she says. Great post, got a lot of engagement and a lot of very divisive comments, which I found interesting. I read that post and I was like, yeah, I like this. Yeah, clap, clap, clap. And then I read some of the comments and I was like, okay, this is much more complicated than it seems at face value. So there's a lot of people agreeing with her, but then there are a couple of people who kind of say, listen, this sounds nice in theory, but operationalizing this is a beast and it's really, really, really complicated. There's a commenter who says, particularly for heavily regulated companies, this is almost impossible. We can make a payment with a candidate as a 1099, but that will make tax season a huge pain for them, likely not worth the hassle. To W-4 them, we'd need to hire them, which creates all kinds of problems. So he's, requesting some insights on how to actually execute on this idea for companies like that. Again, so many interesting things that I wouldn't have even considered, but that are true barriers to this being an easy process. So I don't know. I think that there's a lot of that nice in theory, but hard to execute mentality around this.
Yeah, I'm just laughing. I go back to my marketing days. I remember when we sent $99 or $100 gift cards very intentionally because that was the threshold right before you would have to tax recipients on it. And yeah, hey, candidate, we're going to give you a $99 gift card to Outback Steakhouse for your time. Like that just comes across as just, I don't know. I don't think it would work well in there. But okay, so to pay or not to pay.
Mm.
It depends on what you're doing with the output that comes from that interview, at least in my point of view. So, have had these same conversations internally. The way I've always taken it is I've been in the mindset where we usually don't pay. Again, these are people that are looking for the job. They want to convince us. I don't want, I mean, technically, probably have people, if they figure out how to gamify it enough, like go and take a bunch of interviews and get paid. And that's their job, is to interview and never be the hire. I'm good. I don't need to take it. But the way that I've seen it is I preface the call with, we'll call it, let's pretend there was I don't know, someone who's going to create a website for you. We're trying to find a website designer. And their project is create a new homepage for us. Don't spend more than 3 hours on it. Just, high level messaging. How would you lay it out? Things like that. And the one thing that I would tell them is this is not a paid project. We will not be using any of the intellectual property that you've created in this. This is yours. If we hire you, then we would love for you to move forward with something like this, if this is something that we love, or the direction we choose. But even if you don't make it, this is yours. If we do want to use the knowledge production from this, we will then pay you for that if that's a direction that we want to go. But that's why I've been the mindset. And that's where it's hard, because that's, the knowledge worker economy versus, if you were to go back 100 years, put someone on the manufacturing line at a car plant and say, yeah, come do this for an hour and see, like, you'd have to pay them $20 an hour or something like that, because they're producing the cars for you, putting certain parts in it. So just because it's coming out of your brain onto paper, Google Docs, wherever, I think that's where I usually start to draw the line a little bit there, because to me, interviewing, time is part of the process. Whether I'm spending 3 hours preparing for a specific project or 3 hours researching the CEO, the CMO, the CFO who are going to be in the room, what the company's been focused on, reading all the recent press releases, going and looking at, anything I can find on them, I'm going to be spending that time on them. It's just now refocused into where it's going. So again, that's my personal take on it. And that's why I love this conversation, because everyone has different points of view on it. And I don't think there's one that truly is perfect.
Yeah, I really liked the point that you brought up about ownership of the work. I think it's a really interesting thing of, if you pay the candidate for their work, then technically the company owns the rights to that work at that point. So there are some implications for the candidate, at face value. Getting paid for your work and for your time sounds nice, but then, okay, well, I don't own this work anymore. The company technically has the rights to it. Does that mean I can show it in my portfolio now moving forward without asking for permission? Like, there's so many implications there. And so I think that that's an interesting element to consider before kind of jumping into this. I think that then you also get into just the diciness of, having those conversations that are a little bit more, I don't know if boring is the right word, but just like some of those more like nitty gritty conversations happening too early on can almost just kind of, it's not being transparent, but instead it's just like, okay, do we need to be like nickel and diming each other like right off the bat? That seems kind of just like it sets a weird precedent for the relationship on some level. So I don't know. I think that, again, it's one of those things that sounds really nice at face value, but once you start getting into the implications and to the logistics, it can become really complicated very fast. You saying the thing about the person who just interviews constantly as their job, it sounds like the plot of like a Will Ferrell movie, like The
Right?
Interviewer. He just keeps going around as like the ultimate scam. He just gathers all of this money from interviewing. I would watch it. It reminds me of, actually, I had the work trial from hell, actually, at one point in my career, early on, right out of college. I was looking at jobs on LinkedIn, was very, very green. I didn't know what I was doing. And I saw this job for a marketing role at AT&T. And I was like, oh, that sounds great. I applied. I heard back the next day. They called me in for an interview. They said, hey, this is going to be kind of an immersive interview experience. Come wearing a blue polo and khaki pants. And I was like, okay, weird, but I'll be there. I showed up and it was a full day of field work, going door to door, installing AT&T fiber. And that was considered a marketing account manager role. So, interesting work trial situation. I did get paid for it, which I found very interesting. I never followed up. I got offered the job at the end of the day, and then I left it there. I said, no, thank you. I will not be doing this. But I did get paid for my one day as an AT&T fiber salesperson. So I don't know where that leaves me when it comes to paid or unpaid, pros and cons, but I've got that $70 sitting in the bank somewhere.
High paying. Yeah, they pull one over your head and you're like, oh yeah, by the way, thanks for the last 7-8 hours of work.
Exactly. Yeah, I mean, it was really late at night by the time I got done. So, but I sold several houses fiber. So
Well,
Could
they
have been
made
a very
money. So
lucrative
you didn't
path
get the
for me.
commission. You just got an hourly rate. So
No,
yeah, they made out on that one.
exactly. Yeah.
Oh
Anyway,
man.
so some interesting discourse there. I think one thing that could be helpful to kind of touch on is just the bounds of what a work trial could be. One thing that I found really interesting is there are some companies who do very extensive work trials, like 4 to 6 weeks. Gumroad is a really good example of a company that does that, at least recently. I don't know if they're doing this anymore, but they'll hire candidates as contract employees for a 4 to 6 week period and pay them for their work, obviously. And throughout the trial, they'll just kind of mark certain tasks as ones that are good for a trial worker. And they'll assign those tasks throughout the interview process. They could be working 20 to 25 hours a week. It's really immersive. They've got access to Slack. They've got access to all of the internal tools that they would be using in their actual role. So it's this kind of like really slow, staggered onboarding experience in some sense. You're interviewing them, but you're also onboarding them at the same time. So I found that really interesting. And I think for certain roles, something like that can really make sense, especially theoretically, a candidate could be doing a work trial of that nature with two companies at the same time and vetting those two companies. There's some interesting ways to kind of slice and dice that, I guess.
Yeah, for the time commitment, that's interesting. Because it's so funny. I keep going. You say cons, I go to pros. You say pros, I go to cons now. So I'm thinking like 4 to 6 weeks. Do you have insurance coverage? Do you have benefits? All that. Because if you're
Ooh.
like, how do you balance, like, if you're doing 20, 30 hours a week, can you afford to not have some of those? So again, that's just where my head goes with some of these. But the concept is interesting because it gets you out of, the first 2 weeks of the honeymoon phase. You're in a new company, like, hey, here's your new cup with our logo on it. Here's your new t-shirt. Here's your happy hour with the team. And after that, it starts to fade and you get into the rhythm of like, what's a real day in the life like? So I do like that it is extended for that time. So I can see it working well. Yeah. Where you have instances that you don't need a ton of internal knowledge about like how the product works, how your market works, where it's more just kind of like plug someone in. They just kind of have to like go through tasks, as you said. But
Yep.
if it is someone where it's like you need to understand the ins and outs of the market, you need to understand how the product works, I think that's where something like this might get a little bit trickier.
Yeah. A company that does something similar but way less extensive is Linear. They do contract employees as well, but they only do it for 3 to 5 days. Thought that was interesting because, again, it doesn't give you that full immersive culture
Hmm.
experience, but you do still have access to all of the company's accounts. You're really in it and immersed for those days. And you get kind of a picture of, okay, what would my actual day to day look like? And then you walk away from it paid. The interesting implication there, though, is it's a big team involved. They involve a project team, a recruiter, a hiring manager, and 3 to 5 teammates who would closely intersect with the role once hired. So for 3 to 5 days, there's several people who are pretty involved. There's also a people ops coordinator who would be handling all of the logistics of like an NDA, temporary access to tools, scheduling meetings, all of that. And so I think it's one of those things where certain companies might have the capacity to make something like
Hmm.
that happen and others just might not. And it becomes kind of that values matrix of, okay, is this something that is worth my time? Is this something that is going to a role that I really need that right fit, that it's worth investing all of that extra time up front, all of these resources up front to ensure that this is the right person? And if that's true, then something like this might make sense.
That's an interesting one. Yeah. So just a shortened, summarized version of it almost.
Exactly. Exactly. And then even still, there are the smaller, 3-hour projects, 1-day projects, 1 day selling AT&T fiber. They
Hmm.
run the gamut. There's the full range and the full spectrum. So
Okay. So hot take. You a fan of them? Yes, no? No
I'm a
marketing, it
fan.
depends answer.
I know that's my gut instinct, but I am a fan of a work trial. I think, again, they should be approached with a very nuanced perspective of certain trials make sense for certain roles. Sometimes they do not make sense, but in the grand scheme, I think if I was choosing yay or nay, I would be on the yay side of the fence, and I would say just be reasonable and have very transparent conversations around the expectations associated with this work trial so that the candidate can make the best decision for them, just like you are making the best decision for you and for the hiring team.
I love it. Honestly, I couldn't have said that better, summarized better, wrapped
All
this
right.
better. So we're gonna end on that note. That is perfection right there. So
Okay.
Lex, thank you as always for joining. I love a good trending topic episode with you, and I
Me
hope
too.
this spurs. I hope we start to hear from some people, like the discussion that this generates, get other people's thoughts and everything else. So send those over to us if you definitely have a take on it. So As we wrap, Becoming a Hiring Machine is a production of Loxo. If you like this episode, but you're not sure where to go next, we've got a link in the show notes to a similar episode to this. All the show notes are in the description of your favorite podcast streaming platform, as well as on our website, loxo.co/podcast. Full video episodes are available of our beautiful faces on YouTube, as well as on our website. And if you have questions, looking for advice, have a take on this, send it to us, podcast@loxo.co. So, all right, everyone, that was the show. That was yet another great Trending Topics episode with Lex. Until next time, bye, y'all.